Hello, everybody, and welcome to this talk. It's certainly the most atmospheric place I've ever been in for a lecture, and probably the most appropriate place in view of the subject matter. I'm going to talk about aspects of the Civil War in County Louth, not trying to cover it in total because there's simply too much of a story in it to cover in 40 minutes or so. So I'm just going to cover some aspects which don't get much discussion and which maybe should get a bit more discussion. So going back, you have to go back a little bit in early 1922, and Milman Army Barracks in Drogheda, that's it there, was evacuated at the end of January 1922, and it was taken over by local units of the IRA. Westgate and South Quay Barracks were evacuated in the middle of March, on the 15th of March, and they were also taken over by the local IRA. But there was a split, even at this stage, there was a split looming within the IRA over the terms of the treaty. And the Millmount garrison was referred to in local police documentation as rebels, in inverted commas, as early as the 17th of March, which was almost 2 weeks before the IRA formally split and most of it repudiated the authority of the Army headquarters and of the Dáil. So after the split in Drogheda, the Millmount garrison went anti-treaty, while the IRA in Westgate and South Quay continued to take orders from GHQ and from the government. And 3 days later, on the 29th of March, the RIC evacuated Dundalk, and Ann Street and Bridge Street barracks were taken over by IRA units under the command of Monaghan man Patrick McKenna, and they also repudiated the treaty. So the only IRA presence in Dundalk at this early stage was anti-treaty forces. And then on the 30th of April, a black and tan who was in Drogheda picking up a clergyman who was to conduct services in Gormanstown was shot and killed. And this prompted a retaliatory raid by the Tans on Drogheda, who shot up the centre of the town for 8 hours. And in response, the Irish government sent down units of the National Army, the newly formed National Army, to keep the peace. And there was a standoff between the Millmount garrison and the National Army. Ultimatums were issued for the evacuation of Millmount, but the deadlines came and went and nothing happened. And the pro and anti-treaty forces remained face-to-face in Drogheda. But with the RIC gone and a replacement Irish police force not yet organised, there was a great need for what might be called ordinary police work. And local police forces were set up in Dundalk and Drogheda and Ardee, paid for by local businessmen. And these are commonly called the IRP, the Irish Republican Police. But in fact, they showed themselves to be independent of the IRA, especially in Drogheda. The anti-treaty IRA in Drogheda renewed action in support of the Belfast boycott, which was counter to the wishes of the same businessmen who were paying the wages of the police. And the IRA had publicly warned the police against interference with the boycott. So it was inevitable that sooner or later, the police would confront the anti-treaty forces. And in an incident unrelated to any political motive, John Halpen, who was brother of Thomas Halpen, who was killed by British forces in 1921, was arrested at the end of May 1922 for shooting at police officer Peter Paul Callan from Drogheda with intent to kill, and was remanded in custody, first being held in the Curragh and then in Dundalk prison. So these were the anti-treaty garrison in Millmount. And on 25th of June, 5 members of the Millmount garrison were arrested by the police, by local police in Drogheda, for hijacking Belfast goods. And on the same day, arrests were made in Dublin for the same offence. And in retaliation, the IRA in Dublin arrested National Army General J.J. O'Connell and refused to release him unless the Drogheda men and those arrested in Dublin were released. And the scene was now set for the formal outbreak of the Civil War. And on the 28th of June, artillery fire was opened up on the anti-treaty headquarters in the Four Courts in Dublin. And on the same day, 4 of the Drogheda prisoners escaped, and made their way to Millmount. Along with, it was reported, 9 rifles, a large amount of ammunition, and 5 of their guards who decided to switch side. The Civil War made its presence felt in Drogheda quickly, and executive forces, this is what the anti-treaty IRA were called, opened up intermittent fire on the National Army troops. And on Thursday, the 29th of June, which was the day after the forecourts started, in Westgate and Southgate barracks, and the army cordon around Millmount was attacked. And this is the day that Liam Leach, the section commander in the Millmount garrison, was shot dead by an army sniper. And volunteer John Lynch of the National Army from County Meath was wounded in the leg and died later in College Hospital. Now, a couple of days later, the army moved up artillery, and you can see that photograph on the left. This is, I don't know how many pieces, was it 1 or more? Maybe someone can tell me, were actually used in Drogheda, but this is obviously one that was used. On the right-hand side there, you see the artillery piece logbook, and you just may be able to make out 1, 2, 3, 4 lines down, Millmount, Drogheda on the 4th of July, and it fired 40 rounds of artillery. And just on top of that, just in perspective, is the number of rounds it fired at the forecourts, and it fired 375 rounds at the forecourts. And it seems it was only up for the one day in Drogheda, 4th of the 7th. And then it moved to Cork, where it fired 25 rounds and didn't get much use after that. But that's anyway a photograph of probably one of the guns that was used in Drogheda. As the fighting continued in Drogheda in a truly bizarre event, on the 1st of July, 2 heavily armed men hijacked a train in Drogheda and forced the driver and fireman to take it to Dundalk, where the hijackers made their way to the prison and gained admission by holding a policeman and a prison warder at gunpoint. They demanded the release of 3 Drogheda men, among them the aforementioned John Halpen. And in a few moments, the Drogheda men were in the hallway, and the wardens, together with the police, had been locked in a large room. The ex-prisoners marched out. They bid a cheery "good night, boys" to those who were locked within, and the 5 of them then made their escape in a waiting train. 3 days later, Millmount surrendered. Millmount fell on the 4th of July on the same day. That's a picture of the triumphant Free State Army, colorized. So 3 days later, on the 4th of July, the fighting ended in Drogheda with the capture of Millmount. Meanwhile, in Dundalk, there was another prison escape, this time involving 12 men who were from Belfast and had been on their way through Dundalk to join the anti-treaty forces in Dublin. A number of them removed shoes from a shoe shop in Clonbrassil Street without paying. They were arrested and tried by the police and the Dáil courts, and they were sentenced to 2 weeks imprisonment in Dundalk Jail. On the 4th of July, a little boy carrying parcels knocked on the door of the jail. When the warder opened up, 2 armed men pushed him in and demanded the release of the 12. A lorry was hijacked and headed south out of the town. About 5 miles from Dundalk, they were in the process of cutting down telegraph poles when they were confronted by John McCoy, adjutant of the Fort Northern, and a number of officers, all of whom were unarmed. McCoy returned to Dundalk, organised an armed search party, and recaptured 6 out of the 12 after a chase and an exchange of gunfire, during which their leader, Captain Charles Byrne from Belfast, was shot and wounded. But both escapes raise interesting matters. They showed just how porous Dundalk prison was. Security really was lax, even before the hole in the wall escape. The second escape was an illustration of the complicated balancing act that the Fort Northern was engaged in. Although they had declared neutrality in the Civil War, they were politically leaning towards the anti-treaty side, and yet they had also determinedly pursued and recaptured Republicans who had escaped from Dundalk prison, as a public illustration that law and order would be enforced without fear or favour, and probably in the hopes that the government would recognise that left to their own devices, the 4th Northern would pose no threat. This happened on the 4th of July. Within 2 weeks, things had changed dramatically. When Dundalk Army Barracks was taken over in April 1922, Pádraig Quinn, a close associate of Aiken, but who up to that point had been active in Dublin, was appointed quartermaster. In the absence of anyone else, Pádraig Quinn actually signed for the stores that were handed over by the British Army as they left the barracks. And for some hours, he was the only person other than the British Army in the barracks. Later that day, Aiken moved in with his officers and men who were mostly from the Newry area. Michael O'Hanlon had a low opinion of the men who moved in to Dundalk Barracks. And I quote, "We had Catholic ex-soldiers as a garrison in Dundalk. They were the scourings of the towns and always a nuisance for one. Our good men were on the border. There were 100 of them ex-soldiers, but we didn't even trust them to look after the provisions." Aiken used some of the Dundalk Barracks garrison in an ambush at Drummontea on the 17th of June, but according to McCoy, some of the men panicked and ran. Aiken was furious and had to be dissuaded from court-martialing many of them. There were other problems within Dundalk Barracks. Dominic Doherty, who had a long and respectable active service with the IRA in Down Armagh, County Louth, was officially officer commanding of the barracks and had the rank of commandant. But he complained that the appointment of Pádraig Quinn as quartermaster effectively reduced his rank to that of captain. So already personal ambitions were causing problems. And more importantly, the question of payment of the men in the barracks arose early on. Officers who remained loyal to GHQ, like Aiken, McCoy and others, after the IRA split in March, were being paid by the government. When Aiken took over the barracks, he had the option of attesting his men in the newly formed National Army. If they did, they would get uniforms and regular supplies, and more importantly, get paid a regular wage, about 25 shillings a week, which is better pay than was available, for instance, as a labourer in civilian life. Aiken decided not to attest the men. His logic was that he wanted to retain operational control over the 4th Northern, and he feared that if the men were attested, that GHQ would assume direct control over them, and consequently they, unlike Aiken and senior officers, remain unpaid. It seems, however, not all of his officers were paid. Dominic Doherty recalled that during his 4 months in Dundalk Barracks, he received only £6 in wages. Now, the absence of wages was very hard on the men, many of whom were married, and many of them had to leave Ulster because of the activities of the Ulster Special Constabulary. They literally had nothing except the clothes they stood in. By July, the matter of pay had become an open sore for the men. A number of them refused to take ordinary duty on the basis that they were not getting paid like regular Free State Army soldiers, even though they were carrying out similar duties. The entire garrison was paraded, and Divisional Adjutant John McCoy informed them that while everything they got, such as clothing, boots and food, was free, there was no funds for pay. And that wasn't strictly true. At the time of his capture by the Free State Army, McCoy had £500 in his office safe in Dundalk Barracks, intended for the relief of the IRA men and their families who had fled Ulster, but it had never been distributed. On the 12th of July, McCoy faced further trouble when an officer and 4 or 5 men broke into the arms store, took a Lewis gun, a number of rifles, stole a car and disappeared. The alarm was raised and McCoy caught up with them in Drogheda, where they were in custody of the National Army. They were taken back to Dundalk, and along with Dominic Doherty, who was aware of the events as they occurred, were court-martialed. Doherty was dismissed and told to leave the area immediately. All the rest were imprisoned. Pádraig Quinn recollected, Doherty, who was in charge of the barracks up till 12th of July, was found incompetent. Having a good record, it was decided not to relieve him, but to make the barracks a higher command, a brigade with the late Sean Quinn as officer commanding. Doherty was very much annoyed at this, and I think first thought of deserting in the ordinary sense of the word. However, he decided to get a few days' leave. We next heard of him in Portobello, which was the headquarters of the Irish Army. According to Doherty himself, I rebelled against the rule of Aiken and Company. I left Dundalk, reported the position to General Mulcahy and General O'Duffy. When they decided to send me down to prepare the way with some of my men who remained in the barracks for Major General Hogan to take over Dundalk. Now, at this point, John McCoy was the de facto officer commanding of the 4th Northern in Aiken's absence, who was in Limerick trying to stave off an expansion of the Civil War fighting. Aiken recalled that when he arrived back in Dundalk on Friday the 14th of July from his mission to Limerick, he recalled that I found their orders to attack the executive forces in my area, and also an order for myself, divisional staff, and brigadiers to report to GHQ on Saturday, the 15th of July. That night, Aiken met all brigade and battalion commanders and divisional staff, including executive forces, and they agreed that unless the provisional government gave them, quote, a constitutional way of carrying on for the Republic, we would give them no support, moral or material. They also decided to conceal all arms and war material. Over the following 24 hours, arms dumps were set up outside Dundalk by Aiken. In a significant decision that illustrated their intention to avoid an armed clash with the National Army, they also decided that all military camps and posts would be evacuated in the event of a final break with General Headquarters. If the situation had been handled correctly by the government forces and Aiken carried out these decisions, there's no reason to doubt that he would. What happened over the next few days would have been avoided, as would the death and destruction which followed. On the 15th of July, Aiken went to Dublin with his officers and reported on his meeting to Mulcahy. Mulcahy requested more details of how the problems could be resolved in the form of a memo from members of the government. Aiken wrote this memo on the night of the 15th and 16th of July in Dundalk Barracks, and, as I quote, at 5:30 on the morning of the 16th, I awoke with 2 Thompsons at my nose. The men holding the Thompson submachine guns were from the 5th Northern Division under the command of Dan Hogan, based in Monaghan, who had during the night infiltrated Dundalk and captured virtually all of Aiken's outposts and men. In his report, Hogan stated that he captured 300 men. Not all of Aiken's men were in prison. In fact, a considerable number seems to have opted to change sides. And we know that 127 men were transported to the Curragh for training in the National Army. But a dispute arose over their terms of engagement, and they were taken back to Dundalk and effectively dumped on the streets. Others remained in Dundalk, signing up immediately to the National Army. In fact, the first National Army casualty in Dundalk occurred a few days later when Sergeant John Lavery from Tandregee, County Armagh, an ex-British soldier and ex-4th Northern man, was shot dead in a pub in Bridge Street on the 17th of July. And after the shooting, a number of men who, like Lavery, had changed sides, were armed and under their own officers sent out to search houses in the Church Street, Linden Hall Street area, looking for those responsible. 2 officers with revolvers drawn walked down Bridge Street, and one fired shots in the air, exclaiming as he did so, "We will have blood for blood somehow." So the legend of the 4th Northern and the somewhat authoritarian leadership of Aiken ruling over his bailiwick like a unique fiefdom, as one historian called it, is called into question by the events of June and July 1922. We know now that there was dissension within the ranks of the 4th Northern for various reasons. Pay was one, support for provisional government was another, and it turns out the corollary non-support for the provisional government, also opposition to the provisional government. Now, Aiken always maintained that up to the point he was attacked, he was accepting orders from GHQ. And indeed, he was. He was deeply involved in all of the government-sponsored activities against Northern Ireland since January 1922, and had turned down an offer from Michael Collins to a new position as officer commanding of all Northern forces. Locally, there was no doubt but that Aiken supported the government, unlike the openly anti-treaty forces in Ann Street Barracks. Aiken had supplied armed guards for the prison when requested, however grudgingly, and when Hogan's invasion took place, the governor of Dundalk prison recalled the confusion within the jail, as they had regarded the Fort Northern as government troops and initially refused demands to open up for Hogan's men and actually looked for assistance from Aiken. Mulcahy acknowledged that Aiken had managed to keep the peace in the area, but he also maintained that there were dangerous forces within the Fort Northern that Aiken could not control that made the invasion of Dundalk necessary. In the weeks that followed, a series of raids and arrests by the National Army took place in and around Dundalk. The jail was cleared out of, quote, ordinary criminals on Saturday the 22nd and replaced by political prisoners, in quotes, brought in by train from Dublin, which probably explains the high number of outsiders, if you want to call them that, in the list of escapees. Members of the National Army guarded the jail itself, although it was staffed by regular prison guards. I just wanted to show you this photograph. It's a very interesting photograph, I think. It's probably from 1922. It shows some of the main players in the National Army, in the Fort Northern. And on the back there, P.D. Boyle, who was Frank Aiken's close colleague for many, many years. Next is Aiken. Next is Michael O'Hanlon and John McCoy, who was the brains, if you like, behind the hole in the wall escape. Sitting up front is Padraig Quinn, who I've quoted from, and Ned Fitzpatrick. It's strange in a way how often the names of these people will crop up in the narrative. On the 23rd of July, McCoy, that's him on the right standing, held a meeting of the remaining officers of the Fort Northern in open air at Fahart Graveyard. They agreed to take offensive action against government forces, but only after, on McCoy's instance, they had formally ended their policy of neutrality and given the government 48 hours to evacuate their divisional area, release all prisoners, and respect the Fort Northern policy of neutrality. And this arises again that they wanted to do things in a correct manner, no matter if you agree with their policies, they wanted to be seen to do the right thing. So rather than attacking straight away, McCoy decided, no, we have to make our intentions clear, and which is what they did, which makes it even more strange that they got away with what they got away, because they had warned that they're going to do something. And on the 27th of July, McCoy mustered the Fort Northern Division at Castletown Mount. One detachment under the, now there's the map, courtesy of Jean. So they mustered on the Fort Northern at Castletown Mount. One detachment under the command of John McCoy made for the prison, which is the lower left. One detachment under for the prison. Another under Edward Boyle isolated the train station, which is quite close to the station there. And another group under Frank Monaghan was left to keep the path clear north at Castletown Road, which is top left-hand corner there. And the fourth group was to isolate the military barracks and Key Street train station, which is the centre right there. And while these dispositions were being made, Aiken assembled his men. And here on the left-hand side is the photograph, aerial photograph of the area. On the left-hand side, you see the jail. That circular view there, you see, is the exercise yard. And it was from here that basically most of the men escaped. Aiken assembled his men to take morning drill inside the prison in a circle of peace there. At about 7:15, Ivor Monaghan and Malachi Quinn laid a mine outside the perimeter wall on the Ardee Road, which is just opposite where that white line is, really. Followed shortly by loud and violent explosions. To further disorientate the warders, hand grenades were also thrown. Windows were broken up to a quarter of a mile away, and the nearby county infirmary that's on the right there in the slap center of the photograph. In the county infirmary, windows were smashed and huge lumps of masonry smashed from the ceiling. The explosion blew a large hole in the base of the wall and was followed by a number of small explosions of hand grenades designed to keep the prison guard disorientated. And through that hole, Frank Aiken and 104 men made a dash for freedom. According to the warders' accounts, the men had just been addressed by Aiken and were lined up to enter the exercise yard when there was a loud explosion followed by 3 smaller ones. And in the dust and confusion, prisoners were seen rushing for a gap in the perimeter wall. Attempts to grab keys held by 2 warders were unsuccessful when the keys were thrown over the secure fence, thwarting the escape of the remaining 30 or so prisoners. The warders, who were unarmed except for batons, complained that the military guard, composed of an officer and 26 men stationed in the prison hospital, failed to turn out until the prisoners had escaped, and not a shot was fired by the small detachment of troops who were actually on duty at the time. So back to this, at the same time, a train was hijacked and driven onto the level crossing at Key Street, and there in the centre right. Captain McMahon of the National Army was wounded when reinforcements rushing to the prison came under heavy fire at the Barrack Street Bridge. As troops from Ann Street Barracks went in pursuit of the escapees who were heading north, directly north, they came under fire from Frank Monaghan's men at Castletown Cross and the National Army Private J.F. McCaffrey from Derry Yard, Rosslea, was killed. In the meantime, McCoy, Aiken and others reached cars about a mile from the prison, but were unable to get them started. While the escapees proceeded on foot, McCoy and 2 others were surrounded and captured. An analysis of the prison register shows that just about half of the escapees were from the Fort Northern. The remainder were mostly from County Meath and the Midlands. While Aiken made good his escape, for most, freedom was short-lived. It was reported that by Saturday, 60 of the 104 who had escaped were back in custody. Now, folklore has it that Aiken and his Fort Northern escaped. The details show otherwise, but beat that as it may, with this escape, Aiken assumed near legendary status with this and his subsequent actions. And it was recalled by one internee that the mere mention of his name could embolden Republican captives and unnerve his enemies. And even today that legend is strong. The most common request for information received by the Louth County Archives, now housed in the old jail, being in relation to that escape. I'm not going into detail of Aiken's retaking of Dundalk, that's for another day, except to note a couple of salient points. Before his counter-attack, intriguingly, Aiken, even at this stage, attempted to parley with the provisional government. And on the day before his attack, Saturday, the 13th of August, engaged with discussions with Peter Hughes, pro-treaty TD for County Louth. To what exact purpose, I don't know. According to Michael O'Hanlon, he said, Frank Aiken was pushing Peter Hughes, the TD, as hard as he could. And on the Saturday before we attacked the town, he sent Tom Rogers in to see Hughes in Dundalk to say he would have to do something about the situation. Aiken in 1936 wrote, I also felt it necessary to inform pro-treaty army headquarters through Peter Hughes TD that I had decided to attack their forces in Dundalk. Now, this seems extraordinary, even more so that the intelligence on these talks did not reach the army, as evidenced by the chaos that surrounded the army response the following day when Aiken did actually attack. Aiken attacked and he took Dundalk together with a massive amount of arms and ammunition on Sunday, the 14th of August. the day of the funeral of Arthur Griffith. Six members of the National Army were killed and 9 were wounded. It was reported that 30 of Aiken's men were also wounded. Most of the fighting took place down in the army barracks. The National Army immediately prepared to counterattack, which they did 4 days later. And Aiken had placed mined barricades on the approaching roads, and the road from the centre of the town to the army barracks was turned into an extensive killing zone with mines on the roads and snipers along the rooftops. But Aiken probably realised that he could not hold Dundalk, especially against an army that was shown itself capable and willing to use artillery in an urban theatre. Aiken was dissuaded from going ahead with an armed defence of the town by the local clergy from St. Patrick's. One lorry bomb was set off at the junction of Park Street and Eyre Street, and James McAvoy, an innocent passerby on his way to work in the distillery, was killed. Now, by my count to date, 57 people from Louth or in Louth died as a result of the Civil War, comprising 26 members of the National Army, 23 members of the IRA, 1 member of the RIC, and 7 civilians. This was twice the number of people killed during the period 1916-1921. There are cases with strike a chord. I'm just going to refer to one because it sums up a lot of the tragedy of the Civil War. There was an ambush at Essexford on the Louth-Monaghan border on Tuesday, the 21st of November. There was an explosion underneath tons of gravel as an army patrol passed by, followed by a fusillade of shots. The driver of the army truck, volunteer Bernard Louis Connaughty, received a bullet wound in the head, losing control of the lorry, which crashed into a ditch and dumped the men onto the road. 5 other soldiers were wounded, as was their officer, Lieutenant Commandant Smith, who received a gunshot wound in the eye. The anti-treaty forces relieved them of their guns, ammunition, and equipment, comprising of 7 rifles, 1 revolver, 500 rounds of .303 caliber bullets, 12 rounds of .45 caliber bullets. The anti-treaty forces left with a warning that, quote, for every man executed in Dublin, 12 men of the Free State Army would fall in reprisal. It was also reported that they left field dressings and called on houses nearby, requesting that assistance should be given to the wounded soldiers. The ambush at Essexford drew praise from Liam Lynch, who was Chief of Staff of the IRA. And he said, Carrickmacross ambush was very satisfactory and a great credit is due to the few men engaged on scene. This operation shows all officers commanding the importance of concentrating on the mine. The general activity of the Dundalk Brigade is very satisfactory for this week. Louis Connaughty was an ex-British soldier who had served in the Royal Irish Fusiliers and the Labour Corps during the Great War. He was from Belfast. Previously employed as a lorry driver, he left that employment as it required him to drive through dangerous parts of the city and join the Irish Army. His father had been forced out of employment in the shipyards in 1920. Shortly afterwards, the whole army were expelled from their home in a Protestant area of Belfast. As a consequence, they were almost totally dependent on Louis for support. It was reported that Connaughty suffered greatly in hospital for 2 days and died in hospital in Dundalk on the 23rd of November. His body lay overnight in St. Patrick's when it was escorted by his National Army comrades to the train station, where it was taken for interment in his native place in the north. Connaughty, a Roman Catholic ex-soldier, forced out of his home and job by the sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland and struggling to support his family in Belfast, represented that which an independent Ireland should have been protecting. Instead, he ended up fatally wounded in a ditch outside Carrickmacross, while Liam Lynch praised the efficiency of the carnage that ended his life. And then we have to consider the executions. In early 1923, Kevin O'Higgins and Patrick Hogan, Kevin O'Higgins was Minister for Home Affairs, and Patrick Hogan, Minister for Agriculture, submitted written memoranda to the government recommending that further executions should take place in the localities not in the context of the armed conflict and to defend the state from internal armies, but to stop the moral decay of the country. This memoranda had a devastating effect, and over the next fortnight, there will be 29 executions in the country, almost half of the total legal executions carried out by the National Army during the Civil War, and 6 of them were carried out in Dundalk. It appears that Dundalk had the dubious honour of being the first centre outside of Dublin where the executions under the new scheme took place. 3 men were executed in Dundalk prison by firing squad on Saturday the 13th of January, 2 days after Hogan's memorandum. Executed were Thomas McCann from Ballurgan, John McNulty of Balix, County Armagh, and Thomas Murray of Kilcarn, Navan, County Meath. McNulty and Murray were captured, tried, sentenced, and executed within 10 days. McCann was similarly dispatched within 7 days of capture. It's worth noting that they were sentenced to death for being in the possession of handguns, not for actually using them. The short time between their arrest, trial, and execution points towards the conclusion that these 3 men were unfortunate enough to be arrested at the very time that O'Higgins and Hogan were pushing for local executions to preserve the moral fibre of the country. How the moral fibre of Louth was preserved by the deaths of these 3 men is not clear. It wasn't then and it isn't now. And more executions were to come. Just over 1 week later, on the 22nd of January, the 3 executions took place in the army barracks of James Melia from Dundalk, Thomas Lennon from Dundalk, and Ferguson from Ballurgan. Again, these men were convicted of having in their possession a revolver in the case of Lennon and Melia, and warlike materials in the case of Ferguson. That night, a crowd made up mostly of women and girls assembled outside the prison, reciting the rosary and singing hymns. Refusing to disperse, revolver shots and machine gun fire was directed over their heads, whereupon the crowd scattered in panic. On the 2nd of April 1923, the last deaths in the Civil War in County Louth occurred, when in the same incident, Sergeant Martin John Daly from Ballybay, County Monaghan, and an IRA volunteer, Bernard Morris of Cullowville, County Armagh, were killed at Ballybinivy, County Louth. And there was an inquest, and the difference in the verdict in the 2 deaths of the inquest jury is striking. It found that Sergeant Martin John Daly was killed in the execution of his duty by a hand grenade thrown from a haggard during an attack on the national troops, and the jury was of the opinion that such persons were guilty of willful murder. In relation to Morris, the jury found that Bernard Morris died as a result of a gunshot wound inflicted by the national troops after he had failed to halt when called upon during an attack on such troops. The difference in the attitude of the inquest jury is striking. Such was the lack of support for the anti-treaty forces by April 1923 in North Louth. But the 2 men died in a pointless skirmish that erupted and was over in a matter of seconds. In one way, the killings are representative of the Civil War in Louth. Neither were natives of the county in which they died. The Armagh man opposed the treaty and the Monaghan man supported it, and both came to Louth to fight over it and die because of it. While Daly is forgotten, Morris's memory is preserved by a roadside memorial in Crossmaglen and the Morris Harvey Sinn Féin Common founded in Crossmaglen in 1971. The general election was called in August 1923, and Aiken ran as Chief of Staff of the IRA for County Louth. And in fact, he topped the poll. But 2 out of 3 TDs for County Louth were pro-treaty. And in fact, first preference votes for pro-treaty candidates exceeded those for anti-treaty by a ratio of 3-1, just as it had in the election immediately pre-Civil War. Aiken himself, although sending out mixed signals, was moving on, gradually moving towards a political rather than military activism. At the IRA convention held in November 1925, a series of motions from country delegates criticized the political drift of the leadership and declared its right to wage war as and when it chose. And one of those critical motions came from County Louth. In the election for the executive, Aiken was replaced as Chief of Staff by Andy Cooney, who topped the poll. Aiken scraped in at the bottom of the poll. Others like PJ Rutledge and Sean Lamass were voted off the IRA executive. Aiken took himself off to the United States. He was ill at this stage in January 1926, where he was to remain for about 15 months. Here he is with Joseph Begley on the left-hand side holding flowers, who I think was De Valera's right-hand man, or he was very close to Dev for many years. While Aiken was there, Sinn Féin split over the question of entering the Dáil, which De Valera proposed should be a matter of tactics rather than principle. From America, Aiken publicly supported De Valera and the establishment of the new party, Fianna Fáil. In the run-up to the first election of June 1927, Fianna Fáil campaigned strongly that they would never take the oath of allegiance. When the Fianna Fáil elected representatives turned up en masse on 23rd of June 1927 to take their seats in the Dáil, they found the doors locked against them when they refused to take the oath. Shortly afterwards, the matter was settled when, in the aftermath of the assassination of Kevin O'Higgins, a bill was passed that required TDs to take the oath. Outmaneuvered, Fianna Fáil took the oath, which they now described as an empty formula, and took their seats in the Dáil. As the Dundalk Democrat noted, it is just as empty as it was in 1922, when Mr. De Valera went to war about it, and as much a formula as it was during all the years that it kept the Republicans out of the Dáil, and was denounced as an invention of the enemy to keep them out. The politics of the period 1923 to 1933 are extraordinarily interesting. Of course, we have no time for it here tonight, and they're particularly interesting in County Louth, right up to the 1940. In 1932, the unmentionable happened, and in the general election, Fianna Fáil gained enough seats to enter government in coalition with the Labour Party. Some in the army and the Gardaí were horrified at the thought, and soundings were made to oppose the transfer of power, which was firmly slapped down by outgoing government ministers and other senior Gardaí and army officers who appreciated the true meaning of the democratic process. Such was the degree of uncertainty that there would be a peaceful handover of power. Legend has it that Aiken took steps to ensure the personal safety of the members of the Fianna Fáil government by issuing them all with handguns. 50 years later, when Aiken died, his family discovered 13 handguns and ammunition in a sealed cabinet amongst his personal belongings. As it turned out, the guns were unnecessary. On the 9th of March, first De Valera and then his nominated ministers, among them Frank Aiken, and cheered on by supporters in the visitors' gallery in the Dáil, in defiance of House rules, were, with a modicum of dignity, duly elected by a vote of the elected members of the Dáil into government, and the sky did not come tumbling down. The Irish public will witness one more remarkable event a week later. A week after taking office, in accordance with the martial atmosphere of the time, the national holiday, 17th of March, St. Patrick's Day, was marked by army parades. And this was the beginning of the day's celebrations. And here you see Frank Aiken and Sean Lamass attending a open air prayer service for the army. I can see the army men behind them. Kind of a remarkable photograph. And it got better. Aiken appeared on a platform in College Green, Dublin, as Minister for Defence, reviewing the ranks of hundreds of troops drawn up from the self-same National Army he had so recently opposed. Behind him, you see him in the back there, stood his ministerial colleague, Sean Lamass, who had failed to be re-elected to the IRA executive 7 years earlier. Also on the platform were an array of army officers who would a few years previously, had the circumstances permitted, most likely have had Aiken and Lamass shot. 10,000 people witnessed the erstwhile gunmen, both dressed, it was noted, in dark lounge suits and soft grey hats, acknowledged the ranks of the National Army infantrymen as they marched by him in salute. Aiken doffed his hat in tribute. Later that day, members of the new government attended a soiree in Dublin Castle, mixing with members of the diplomatic corps and opposition members of the Oireachtas. Some, including Aiken, also attended a civil service céilí. And it was here that General Hugo MacNeill, Deputy Chief of Staff, made an overture to Richard Mulcahy seeking support for a coup d'etat. Mulcahy dismissed him with a peremptory instruction not to be an ass. 10 years separate these two photographs. On the left-hand side, you have Aiken as IRA chief. On the right-hand side, there he is as Minister for Finance. Aiken made a long journey from there. He was still in the IRA probably up to 1925, 26. So it was less than 6 or 7 years between him being Chief of Staff of the IRA and Minister for Defence in the Irish Free State. Kind of remarkable. And that ends my talk. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now to Lorraine.
Hello, everyone, and thanks to the Society for asking me to talk tonight. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some Civil War artifacts and archives that are here in Louth County Archives. Hopefully there'll be some that you haven't seen before. And seeing as we're in the jail here, I'm going to start with the plan of Dundalk Jail, showing the entrance, floor and grounds. This plan was drawn by the trades warder, Jeremiah J. Hayes. At the front, or at the bottom, near the bottom there, you have the Governor's House, and on the right above this is the B-wing cell block on the Carrick Road, which is occupied by Cultists now. And on the left is the A-wing cell block, occupied by Louth County Archives here. Further above the B-wing is a forge and photo house, and to the extreme right near the boundary wall is the hospital where civil defence would be now. At the top of the plan is the back entrance, and to the left of this are the stonebreakers sheds, and over in the top left corner you can see there's an ash pit. And just above the A-wing on the left is the circular exercise yard, and the black solid wall on the bottom left of this that part is still standing today. Just the green areas on the plan are the grass areas, and the grey areas are tillage plots. And as it was done by the trades warder, the line of water pipes and sewer pipes and hydrants and so on are drawn on the plan. The plan itself measures 3 foot wide by 2 foot 3 inches high, and it has a date of 1914 on it. However, the title FS Prison on the left corner there, which presumably stands for Free State, indicates that it was completed in 1922-23. It was found in the Governor's House and was donated by Dundalk Gardaí. A photograph of Ann Street Barracks in Dundalk. This was the main RIC police barracks in Dundalk, and it was located on the northeastern side of Ann Street near the junction with Park Street. I think where St. Anne's Court apartments are situated today. It was one of 3 police barracks in Dundalk around that time. The one on Bridge Street closed just before the War of Independence, and the other one was located at Quay Street in Dundalk. And the RIC pulled out of Ann Street, and the IRA took over the barracks here on the 29th of March 1922. The Civic Guard, later renamed and Garda Síochána, were later located here and stayed until the Gardaí moved into the former Governor's House of Dundalk Prison in 1946, where they have remained since. This circular letter is evidence of the existence of the North Louth Police. And the letter states that a public meeting has decided to establish a temporary police force for the Dundalk and North Louth area. And it is requesting that people pay a voluntary subscription based on their per law valuation. It was set up around April, May 1922, and this letter was received by William Tempest of Crow Street, Dundalk in May 1922. We also have a receipt here stating that Tempest paid the sum of £2.17 on the 15th of May 1922. The letter is signed by the Honorary Secretary T.J. Clancy, and the names of the Honorary Treasurers are also given on the letter: P.J. Daly and T.F. McGahan. This was probably Philip Daly, Senior 4th Northern Division Officer, and Thomas Fitzgerald McGahan, who was editor of the Dundalk Democrat and a local politician. Their names together here are interesting, as Daly was anti-treaty and McGahan pro-treaty. And this next letter is also requesting a subscription towards a police force, this time in the 9th Brigade area, which includes RD. It states, at a meeting held in RD the 21st day of March 1922, the following committee was formed to raise funds for the maintenance of a police force in the brigade area for the coming 3 months. That is, until such time as the Civic Guards come into force. And it gives the names of the committee and explains that a sum of £2,400 is required for the payment, maintenance and transport of a force of 60 police in the 9th Brigade area, half of which has been apportioned to the RD district. So the police force was to act as a temporary force until the Civic Guards came, which turned out to be about 6 or 7 months later, around September, October time in County Louth. This is an advertisement for second-hand revolvers. It states, all in perfect order and all above goods packed and delivered, FOB Belfast. Presumably FOB is free on board, where the buyer pays for the transport. And it contains illustrations and descriptions for about 4 types of revolvers, mainly Webleys. Unfortunately, it doesn't give their price, but it shows the availability of ammunition and how easy it was to purchase ammunition around this time. Óglaigh na hÉireann General Permit to Travel. This permit was issued by the IRA's Military Permit Office in Portobello Barracks, Dublin, to Thomas Rogers of the 4th Northern Division. It was issued on the 17th of July 1922, so that's just after Aiken was imprisoned. The permit allows Rogers to travel to any part of Ireland without his person or property having to be searched. It lasts for 1 month and states that the application for renewal should be made within 1 week of expiration. It's a small document, about 5 inches by 4 inches. It is signed and stamped with an embossed stamp of Óglaigh na hÉireann near the top right corner. It's a bit hard to see. It has the FF for Fianna Fáil in the centre, and around which is the circular form with the text Óglaigh na hÉireann. The next item is Óglaigh na hÉireann again, the 4th Northern Division. It's a leaflet to the citizens of Louth, Down and Armagh, and it was issued by the executive officers of the 4th Northern in the aftermath of the invasion of Dundalk and the arrest of Frank Aiken and most of his men on the 17th of July 1922. It briefs citizens in the area on the new situation of the invasion and imprisonment and appeals for their moral and material support. It declares the IRA in this division has been kept intact and refused to allow itself to be made use of by any political party. Our object has been to secure the unity of the nation, to avoid civil war and the horrible sight of comrades who fought side by side during the English reign of terror, shooting each other down. Seeking the support of citizens, they state that the 4th Northern have fulfilled our guarantees to keep the peace of the district and afford to every citizen the protection to which he is entitled. And it reaffirms near the end that the morale and unity of the army in the division is still secure. This is an extract page from the General Register of Prisoners for Dundalk Prison in 1922, showing names of escapees. In the further remarks column on the right, the escapees generally have the entry rescued from custody the 27th of the 7th, 22. Some also have recaptured 28th of the 7th, 22. This page includes Francis Aiken, on the 3rd row down from the top. The age given for him is wrong. He was 24 at the time, not 38. The data in the offence column over towards the right states detained in military custody, and the court from which committed column states headquarters 5th Northern Division, Dundalk. The information provided in the register includes number, name, description, which is age, height in feet and inches, hair, eyes, complexion, marks on person, weight on admission and on discharge, where born, last residence, next of kin with name and address, trade or occupation, married or single, religion, degree of education, date of committal, offence, court from which committed, and further remarks. On this page, there are people from places such as Newry, Armagh, Cavan, Dundalk, Belfast, and Scotland. Some of the occupations include farmer, labourer, draper's assistant, cattle dealer, painter, teacher, soldier, IRA, schoolboy, he was aged 16, an Irish transport union organiser, motor driver, and shoemaker. And this image is courtesy of the National Archives of Ireland, who hold the original register. A microfilm copy of the register, which dates from 1917 to 1931, is held in Louth County Archives. These photographs, the one on the left is of a provisional government soldier on guard at the hole blown in the prison boundary wall that enabled Frank Aiken and over 100 prisoners to escape on the 27th of July 1922. And then on the right, there's local boys at the hole just blown in the wall. They may be from the Crescent or maybe Ann Street in Dundalk, as St. Malachy's villas wouldn't have been built back then. And this image is courtesy of Jimmy Bellew. And this one, just for anyone who isn't familiar, this is a modern day photograph of the patched up hole in the wall. It's located 10 or 20 metres to the left of the County Archives pedestrian gate on the RD Road. And much of that boundary wall of the former prison is still standing today. An open letter to Richard Mulcahy TD from Frank Aiken, Oakley Nahearn 4th Northern Division. It is dated the 30th of July 1922, a few days after his escape from prison. Aiken asserts in 1 month the troops of the provisional government have their opponents on the run in several counties. In another month or two, they will probably be on the run in the whole country, and then the war will commence in real earnest. Aiken later declares both the pro-treaty and anti-treaty parties have been too quick to assume that the people of this country want peace with England at any price. The people want peace between Irishmen. In this letter, Aiken is urging peace between the warring factions in the Civil War. This is a photograph of a group of members from the 4th Northern Division, some or all of whom were at one stage prisoners during the Civil War period. Included at the front from left to right are Iver Monaghan, Willie Lawless and Jimmy Goodfellow. And at the back from left to right are Peter Boyle, Frank Monaghan, who was a brother of Iver in front of him, Peter Marney and Martin O'Donnell. Iver Monaghan was made the divisional engineer in 1922, and he was in charge of engineering operations in the TAC on Dundalk Jail. And when the military barracks were captured, Iver himself was captured in November 1922 and was interned for about 8 months, as was his brother Frank. He was then transferred to the Curragh. This handwritten letter, it's a bit difficult to read. It's from a tobacconist shopkeeper, Esme Young of Roden Place in Dundalk, to her daughter, Jeannie Mahoney in Drogheda. It's dated the 18th of August, 1922. And it's a 4-page letter, and it details events in Dundalk during the Civil War. And Esme writes, the worst time we had was on Wednesday night, and we spent it mostly in the cellar as the regulars were sniping from the Century Tower next door, from Nicholas Haughey's top window and the distillery. Dr. O'Hagan phoned from the hospital that the Free State troops were in the Workhouse Hills and to send him a good supply of cigs as he would not be home. She later continues, at 10 o'clock we retired to the cellar, as from that time until morning we were in an anxious state, dreading that at the first shot from next door they would shell the Century Tower and we might all be killed. She goes on to talk about the state of the streets in Dundalk after fighting, and refers to the jail escape, saying that the railway and brewery workers were halted and put into clink or into jail until they were identified. And it's a great letter, as it's descriptive and it's full of news. This is a letter to Joseph Dolan of RD, County Louth, from General Richard Mulcahy, Chief of the General Staff, Portobello, Dublin, and it's dated the 26th of August, 1922, so not long after Collins was killed. Mulcahy is replying to a letter received from Dolan concerning Frank Aiken and the anti-treaty irregulars in the RD area. Mulcahy writes, I think nobody appreciates Frank Aiken's mind and position more clearly than I do. Frank was not only negotiating with me for preserving peace in Dundalk when the Dundalk barracks was taken by national troops, he was actually doing it to a certain extent, but very dangerous forces were working underground in his ranks, and Frank could not have controlled them, and their operations would have brought a much worse state of affairs there. This next notice, it's dated the 8th of September, 1922, and it's from the IRA's Field General Headquarters, informing that anyone who conveys information to the Provisional Government's Imperial Forces, which leads to the death, wounding, or capture of Republican troops, will be regarded as spies and will be liable to the same penalties as those inflicted on spies previous to the truce, July 1921. This is a hand-drawn map of the Lordship area in North Louth with ambush locations indicated by an X mark. There is one there at Riverstown Bridge near the right, one at Duffy's Bridge over in the centre, and one near Ravensdale towards the left. The map uses a black line to indicate the boundary of the Lordship area, blue lines to indicate county roads, a broken black line to indicate mountain areas, and a grey line for rivers. The map was with other notes under topics such as defence of company area, qualifications for a sniper, night operations, and so on. This is a lock of the Dundalk Jail inner back gate, which exits onto St. Malachy's Villas, well, where St. Malachy's Villas are today. At that time, I think it was just waste ground and I suppose barbed wire from the jail. And it was through this gate that Frank Rogers and up to a dozen other men escaped from jail. on the 16th of October 1923, and the lock was taken by Frank Rogers and carried with him when he escaped, and it was donated by his son, Aidan Rogers. And this is a view of the jail exercise yard wall as it is today, with the former A wing in the background, which is now Louth County Archives. And this is the Hole in the Wall Centenary booklet that Jean referred to earlier. The booklet was produced as part of the Louth County Council Decade of Centenaries programme 2021, along with the short film on Dundalk Jail during the Civil War. It was produced in collaboration with the Society, and thanks to Donal, who researched and wrote the script. The film and booklet contain a definitive account of the events that led up to the mass hole in the wall escape by Frank Aiken and over 100 men on the 27th of July 1922. And the booklet incorporates a transcript list of escapees taken from the Dundalk General Register of Prisoners and a list of County Louth Civil War fatalities, which was researched and compiled by Donal. There's also a useful map of Dundalk that shows the relevant sites, which Donal showed earlier, thanks to Jean. And links to both the film and the booklet are available on the web pages of Louth County Archives, while hard copies of the booklet can be got from Louth Libraries and the County Archives here. So thanks very much for listening. I hope you found some of those interesting.